This presentation is based on the work of Dr. Bruce Perry as presented in his book, The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog. It includes insights from himself and his colleagues from the Child Trauma Institute. Dr. Bruce Perry has dedicated his life work to understanding how trauma impacts children. His background in neuroscience provided him the framework to view child maltreatment through a developmental lens. His book offers insights on how his clients shaped his work. Dr. Bruce Perry was able to take his work on stress-related hormone systems in rats and research the brain and how it forms. The brain stem is formed first and is the most concrete part of the brain, the primitive brain, and controls body functions like heart rate, temperature, blood circulation. The midbrain is in charge of our movements and coordination and helps us interpret our environment through auditory and visual processing. The limbic part of the brain is the attachment part of our brain. It contains the amygdala, which activates our fight, flight, and freeze responses. And the cortical part of the brain is the thinking part of the brain. It develops last and controls our ability to problem solve, follow directions, and supports language, abstract, and concrete thoughts. Knowing how the brain forms and the functions each region controls will help clinicians working with clients who have a history of trauma and/or maltreatment. All children experience some levels of stress, and predictable small doses can support resiliency to adversity. However, children who are experiencing unpredictable, high amounts of stress are at risk of direct impacts on their brain. Knowing the timing, duration, and intensity of a child's adverse experiences can help counselors investigate the potential impacts on the child's development. Dr. Perry offers some cases to further explore these concepts. In the late 80s, when Dr. Perry started his practice, many people viewed children as resilient and did not recognize the impacts of psychological trauma. However, early trauma can create lasting damage, which shows up in a variety of ways. As the medical model desires an answer to a problem, many children end up with a variety of diagnoses from the DSM without anyone addressing the root problem. Meet Laura, a medical mystery. At 4 years old, she only weighed 26 pounds. When Dr. Perry met her, she had already been through years of invasive tests, with well-intentioned doctors trying to discover the potential new disease. Part of her bowel had been removed, a tube inserted into her abdomen, and finally a diagnosis of infantile anorexia was determined. Dr. Perry was there for a consult and saw minimal interactions between the young mother and her daughter. The brain is a historical organ, and we learn to parent by how we were raised. This is why it is important to gather a history, not just on the child, but the parent's early experiences as well. Laura's mother, Virginia, spent her childhood bouncing from one foster home to another. Without patterned, repetitive, loving care in the first 6 years of her life, her brain did not produce the pleasure hormone oxytocin that we get from human-to-human interactions. She was finally placed with a loving family who taught her manners and Christian values, but once she turned 18, the system explained she had aged out and the foster parents were to have no contact with her. Seeking affection, she soon became pregnant. She knew to give her child food, shelter, and clothing, but did not have the same motherly instincts to meet the emotional needs. Laura had her basic needs met. However, without the love, she was failing to thrive. If a child is ignored when she is smiled or left alone when she cries, she will not associate human contact as safe and predictable. It takes repetition to form security. Virginia did not have enough time with her early care providers to build familiarity with this safety and did not know how to nurture her own daughter. Laura's body responded with hormonal dysregulation that impeded her growth. Virginia was seeking help to understand why her daughter was not growing, but rather than invasive tests, Laura needed love. Both Virginia and her daughter were placed together in a foster home, where Virginia learned to recognize and respond to her daughter's cues for connection. Dr. Perry is clear that blaming parents does not help. Rather, clinicians need to meet families with empathy and curiosity. Trauma can have lifelong impacts, and many cases in his book had a theme of intergenerational trauma. Unpredictable, prolonged stress creates vulnerability and negatively impacts the potential of a person's capabilities. It is important to remember that new experiences process through the past. The first experience a baby has shapes the neural networks, creating a template for future similar experiences. The earlier we can provide intervention, the better. For example, Connor, who came to see Dr. Perry when he was 14 years old. Connor, diagnosed with a dozen disorders, was also overly medicated. He presented with an awkward gait and had trouble with social engagement and regulation. Again, his early history revealed trauma. While his loving parents were at work, the nanny they hired left him alone in his crib as she took on a second job. She checked in on her lunch break to feed and change him, and was home before the parents. It wasn't until he was 18 months old when Mom came home early from work and discovered him alone in his crib. She quit her job to stay home with him, but the damage was done. Dr. Perry uses his neurosequential model to assist Connor and many other children like him. A counselor needs to work with a team of professionals to map out the brain and determine which areas have been impacted by the adverse childhood experiences. In Connor's case, he missed out on being rocked, soothed, and sung to. His social interactions were awkward and he needed to be retaught how to engage with others. His treatment plan started with increasing his tolerance for human touch through self-massage and eventually regular massages. To support his natural rhythms, music and dance were introduced. Dr. Perry knew the interventions were working when Connor reached out for a handshake after a session. Connor also needed social skills to learn nonverbal cues as he missed those early facial expressions. If peers understand these challenges, they can be a great resource to support social skills in others. It takes proper training and a team of professionals to spend time mapping out the child's brain and determining which regions and functions are underdeveloped. The brain develops from the bottom up and the inside out. A knowledge in child development is key. Professionals must create an individualized plan to provide the patterned, repetitive experiences a child needs to resume a more normal developing brain. Counselors need to involve teachers and active people in the child's life to understand the state-dependent learning trauma can cause, as a child who's in a state of alarm cannot learn like other children. Perry works with parents, caregivers, and teachers to understand they need to regulate, relate, and then reason. Children need a calm nervous system and to feel safe and secure in their relationships before they can problem solve or reflect. Many counselors make the mistake of engaging children in talk therapy, encouraging them to express their feelings, which can often re-traumatize them. Rather, clinician needs to come alongside the child, provide play and art materials, and make comments rather than asking questions. Follow the child's lead and know that weekly counseling sessions are not enough. Trauma is not an individual issue. As counselors, we need to advocate for social changes to the system. Programs like Success by Six, Head Start, Canadian Prenatal Nutrition Program, Community Action Program for Children, and quality, affordable childcare are a good start. However, we need to increase social services, including mental health, addictions, housing, employment, and put more resources into the foster care system to help prevent the intergenerational impacts of trauma. We are born to connect to another human being, and we need to ensure children have plenty of positive relationships in their lives, as this builds resiliency to the stress they will experience. However, Perry warns, as we see an increase in technology, there is also a risk of further disconnection. At their core, children need consistent, loving, attuned caregivers to grow. Dr. Perry shares his insight of his practice through case studies. It is important for clinicians to understand there isn't a set manual on interventions supporting children who've experienced trauma. Rather, the child is the manual. Knowing the timing, intensity, and duration of the trauma can help professionals gain an understanding of what areas of the brain were impacted. Observing the child and watching for signs of fight, flight, or freeze. Co-regulating the child and increasing safety is key. Finding the right intervention can be like solving a puzzle. It will take more than weekly counseling sessions to create change. It takes a community, as to change their brains, children need lots of repetitive, positive experiences to create new brain patterns.